Hi everyone, this is Charles Harper at NARUC. Thanks for joining us. We will be getting started in about 1 minute.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 o'clock on the dot. We will go ahead and get started. My name is Commissioner Bocanegra. I'm here from Illinois, and I am pleased to present to you NARUC's Center on Partnerships and Innovation webinar series entitled Volkswagen Settlement and Electrifying Opportunity for EV Charging. We have 3 wonderful panelists for you this afternoon, which I will introduce. The last 15 minutes will be reserved for questions and answers, so feel free to utilize the question box you see on your screen there and submit questions to us during the course of this webinar. So we'll get started. First up, we have for you this afternoon, Nick Nigro. He is founder of Atlas Public Policy. Nick brings a data-driven approach to the public policy field through the greater use of new technology. A nationally known expert on alternative fuel vehicle financing, policy, and technology, Nick works with public agencies, large industries, and advocacy organizations to collect and analyze data from across the internet to inform organizational strategy and create, deploy, and evaluate innovative programs. Nick holds a Master of Public Policy from the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy and a Bachelor of Science in Electrical and Computer Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Next up, we have Hana Terwilliger. She has worked as an economic analyst with the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission since 2016, where she works on a wide range of issues related to electricity, including DER, integrated resource planning, and electric vehicles. Hannah graduated from the University of Minnesota's Humphreys School of Public Affairs with a Master of Public Policy and holds a bachelor's in political science from St. Olaf College. And last but not least, we have Daniel Weekly here with us this afternoon. He is Vice President of Innovation Policy and Development with Dominion Energy. He is responsible for engaging residential, commercial, industrial customers and stakeholders to learn about their energy usage and ideas. Additionally, he leads the company business areas in developing and implementing innovative company policies. Dan holds an executive MBA from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's in both business and finance from Marshall University. So now that we've introduced all of you, we'll jump right in. So Nick, if you want to go ahead and get started, and each speaker will have about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Bocanegra. As soon as my slides pop up, I'll get started. So I'm going to give you all an overview of the Volkswagen settlement for those who aren't familiar with the details of it, as well as a status of what the states are planning to do with their funds and what states have already issued funds. And I'll close with some remarks on the importance of the Volkswagen settlement as it relates to the electric power industry. First, a little bit about my company, Atlas Public Policy. We're based in Washington, D.C. We started back in 2015. Our mission is to bring data and analytical capacity to folks like yourselves, people who work in public policy. We do quite a lot of work on transportation electrification. One of our signature products is called the Atlas EV Hub. That's the next slide, please. The EV Hub is a true one-stop shop for anyone working on transportation electrification. There you'll find information on the market, active and ongoing public policies, including lots of information on electric utility proceedings related to transportation. Anyone that is a public agency can access this content for free. So if you are working at a public agency, I encourage you to sign up. If you don't work at that and you're at a private company or a nonprofit, you'll find the license fees to be quite quite low. All the information that I'm presenting you today is from EV Hub. So again, I encourage you to check it out. It's a valuable resource on transportation electrification. So first things first, a little background on the Volkswagen settlement itself. This was the largest environmental settlement in the US history. It was just a few years ago. It contains a number of components. We're going to focus on one of those in particular, the Environmental Mitigation Trust. But the largest share was actually for Volkswagen to buy back vehicles. For those who don't know or don't remember, essentially what Volkswagen had done was design what's called a defeat device. This was a particular piece of software that was modifying the emissions for the vehicles when they were being tested. That's against the law. And so Volkswagen, as part of the settlement, agreed to buy back those vehicles for up to spend up to $10 billion on that. In addition, they stood up an entity known as Electrify America that is slated to invest $2 billion into zero-emission vehicle infrastructure and programs. Again, Electrify America is a subsidiary of Volkswagen. Another component of the settlement, the one we're focusing on, is the $2.9 billion Environmental Mitigation Trust. This is controlled by the states, the District of Columbia, where I live, and tribes as well. And finally, more recently, there was a $1.45 billion civil penalty. So a lot of money here, and a lot of it is going to go into transportation electrification, as you'll see in just a moment. Another little background on the slide, just so people understand the architecture of the settlement. It starts at $14.7 billion. Not shown here is the $1.5 billion civil penalty, as that did not really get distributed other than going back into the federal government. So in terms of the pool of funds, I mentioned the $10 billion buyback already. That's already happened, essentially. The $2 billion that is controlled by Electrify America for zero-emission vehicle and related programs like education programs is going to be spent out over 10 years. It's actively being spent now. And similarly, the Environmental Mitigation Trust, the focus of my talk today, the $2.9 billion is also being spent out over 10 years. And all of that is frankly up to the states. They have to go through a fairly straightforward process at this point where they have to design a mitigation plan, and then they are free to begin to distribute those funds at a pace of their choosing. So what's the overall status on the settlement? All the states at this point, including DC, have published mitigation plans. Of those 51 plans that we are tracking on EV Hub, 45 of them are final. And what that means is a few of them are still open for public comment periods or are actively being modified. In addition, 31 states have already issued funds or issued requests for proposals as of this month to actually distribute some of those funds. And 9 of RFPs are currently open. And so what you can see from this map is a lot of the states have already moved along in the process and are actively trying to spend the funds. So our interest here today is on zero emission technology and transportation electrification. So what this chart shows you is the likelihood, according to the information we have at EV Hub, on which sections or which options the states have to spend money are going to go into zero emission technology. One portion is for electric vehicle charging. In fact, of the state funds that they receive, only 15% of that can go into light duty electric vehicle charging. What you can see is nearly all the states and jurisdictions that we're tracking are expected to spend some amount of those funds on EV charging. In addition, states could make investments into medium and heavy duty zero emission trucks and school and transit buses. That's a little bit more of a mixed bag. There's a lot more uncertainty there about states based on their current plans, and that's in part because electrification is often just an eligible technology. States could be spending those funds on diesel vehicles or other alternative fuels, and a lot of times the certainty only comes after the states have made awards. And I'll get into this more in a little bit later, but so far transportation electrification has competed well against these other technologies, accounting for somewhere near half of the awarded funds to date. So I alluded to this, but the states have a lot of flexibility in how they can distribute their funds. I apologize for the graphic being a little cut off at the bottom here. So on the left side, you can see the number of states that are targeting money towards any of the 10 mitigation actions or eligible mitigation actions. These include trucks, buses, and off-road vehicles, including ferries and tugs, airport ground support equipment, and I mentioned earlier, light-duty zero-emission vehicle equipment. The funds cannot be used to be purchased light-duty vehicles, only the charging equipment. And what you can see, regardless of the region, the most popular uses of the funds today are for school, shuttle, and transit buses, and for the light-duty vehicle equipment. That's what the left chart is showing you. On the right, you can see it broken down by dollars, and right now we've got somewhere near $860 million based on the plans that we have, that we've tracked, that are going to target school and transit buses, and over $300 million targeted towards light-duty electric vehicle charging equipment. For context, that $300 million, on the $300 million, you'll recall that $2 billion is going to go into zero-emission vehicle infrastructure from Electrify America. And so just to reiterate here, when it comes to the vehicles in particular, you see over $1 billion is going into transit buses and trucks. The states can spend money to subsidize the cost of those trucks and vehicles and also the infrastructure, but they can only use their mitigation funds for light duty infrastructure. They can't use it for light duty vehicles. Breaking down a little bit further on the zero emission vehicle front here. Nearly all mitigation plans have some allocation for zero emission technology. In a lot of cases though, that's just eligible. And what you can see that from the pie chart. Over 60% or so of funding that we've tracked is eligible for zero emission technology. The all color, that means the blue there in the pie chart, that's dedicated. So over $680 million that we've tracked is actually dedicated to zero emission vehicle technology. And only about 5.5% of the funds are specifically not going to be used for that technology. Again, similar to the chart I was showing you earlier, you can see the count of the ZEV states. There's lots of states that are planning to spend money on zero emission technology. Down the bottom is a summary of the funds again, in a different view to show you what the leading pots of or mitigation actions are going to be used for zero emission technology. Right now, that's light duty charging equipment, but there's also over $200 million of the 800 or so totally allocated for school transit and shuttle buses is dedicated to ZEVs. But just one more sec on that other slide. So if you think about, if you're looking at the state plans in particular to see who's got the highest share of dedicated funding, it's Rhode Island. They've got 85%. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the states have made zero emission technology eligible, and it's competed well in the awards issued so far. Arizona, DC, Oregon, and Wisconsin are the only states that we've identified that don't have dedicated funding pots. But of those states, Wisconsin and DC have already issued funds for zero emission vehicles. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides on funding opportunities. 10 states have dedicated money for zero emission trucks and buses. Most of those are targeted at school and transit buses at this point, not as much for trucks right now. That's in part, I would expect, due to the fact that there isn't as much vehicle availability right now on the truck side, especially compared to transit buses. I want to highlight a few programs that have been announced so far. Most recently, Virginia just recently announced a $20 million program to electrify school buses in the state. That's a great complement to what we're going to hear from later from Dan on the big program that's being launched by Dominion. Washington State is also going to electrify their transit buses, or more of them. And in Massachusetts, where I'm from originally, Martha's Vineyard is going to electrify their entire transit fleet with new buses. So what you can see from the map too, on the right here, there's lots of funding opportunities that's dedicated to zero emission trucks and buses. It's not restricted to one region or another in the country. EV charging is probably the biggest success story, I think, of the Volkswagen settlement in terms of trying to attract investments from states and spending from states in this technology. One thing I want to emphasize here is a lot of the states that you're seeing in these bubbles here, these green bubbles, they previously don't have a history of spending or learning about spending investments in putting investments into electric vehicle technology. So even if it's a small program, $1 million or so, what you're doing is building institutional capacity within these states to better understand the barriers and opportunities around electric vehicle charging. And so there's a lot of value in just that capacity building that's ongoing. So I mentioned in total, let's go back there. In total, there's $306 million from 46 states. 37 of those states are allocating the max 15%. I mentioned earlier, only 15% of funds can go towards EV charging. Most of the states that are putting money into EV charging are maxing it out. The largest single investment is from Texas, $30 million. Florida is second with 25. That's currently in the draft state, and third is New York. You might be surprised to not see California there. In fact, they have over $300 million of their plan dedicated to zero emission vehicles, but they have other programs currently focused on light duty infrastructure. So they're not spending nearly as much with this pot of funds. So in terms of the awards, I mentioned earlier that transportation electrification has done quite well as far as receiving awards so far. 21 states have awarded $166 million to transportation electrification as of this month. 86 million is going to transit buses. This is quite complementary to what the Federal Transit Administration has done recently with the low emission, no emission program out of FTA. That's been putting hundreds of millions of dollars most recently in the last few years into electric transit buses. But growing is also school buses. 17% of those funds, $28 million, is going into school buses. This is something that was very much in the very early pilot stages just a couple of years ago, and now we're seeing a lot more school buses being deployed. So that's a positive sign for the market. And then $27 million for charging stations so far. So I want to close with this, some thoughts on why it's important for the electric industry to care about this. The investment opportunity, it's huge, it's billions of dollars. I mentioned Electrify America, they're not the focus of this talk, but they are spending a lot of money and making a lot of investments in fast charging infrastructure, currently for light duty, but I'm sure they'll be considering medium and heavy duty too as well. There's a lot of advancements in new technology, and it's something electric power industry should be paying attention to. It's an uncommon opportunity. As I mentioned, it's rare for many of the states that are spending funds here to have money to invest in light duty infrastructure. And finally, it's important to gain experience and prepare for the future. Atlas on the EV Hub, we've tracked over $350 billion worldwide going into transportation electrification in the near term. Of that $350 billion right now, unfortunately, only about 10% of it is slated for the United States in terms of vehicle manufacturing. It's critical for US policymakers to make the US market an attractive one for those investments, and putting more money towards transportation electrification from the Volkswagen settlement is one positive way I think that states can do that. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick, very much for that presentation and for giving us that background. Next up, we have Hana with the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. Whenever you're ready.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Minnesota PUC's experience with EVs and the interaction we've had with the VW settlement, and then talk about why, as a commission, you might want to pay attention to this as you're working on your own electric vehicle and electrification related issues. Quick disclaimer there, and then go on to the next slide. So the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, we regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and the siting of large energy facilities. So we're about 60 staff located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a little bit about EV regulations in Minnesota. EV charging providers are exempt from PUC regulation unless they are owned by a public utility. And our role is to review and approve any utility EV rate and infrastructure pilots and program requests that we get from our regulated utilities. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is our air quality regulator. The governor recently announced that we will be adopting the ZEV standards, and so the PCA will do the rulemaking. And then they also oversee the fund disbursement for the VW settlement. There are plenty of other state agencies that also play a role in encouraging EV adoption, such as our Department of Transportation looking at different studies, our Department of Administration doing fleet goals. But this is just a snapshot of things that would be more relevant to the Volkswagen settlement. So a little overview of EVs in Minnesota. We hit around 10,000 light-duty vehicles as of April of 2019, with the majority in our largest electric utility, Xcel Energy's service territory. Unsurprisingly, that's where our metro area is. The Public Utilities Commission, we've been active looking into EVs since 2017 when we opened an inquiry into EV charging and infrastructure. And so in that, we made a series of findings saying that transportation electrification is in the public interest. How EVs are integrated with the grid will be critical to ensuring widespread benefits. And that also utilities have a really important role to play in transportation electrification, and specifically thinking about how you can link that up with the VW settlement. And so over the past couple of years, we've considered a number of pilots and transportation electrification plans from our utilities and expect to continue to receive those over the next few years. And as we've considered those, there has been interaction with the VW settlement, which I can talk about a little more. Next slide. So I just thought I would very quickly go over Minnesota's Volkswagen settlement with the disclaimer that the PCA, the Pollution Control Agency, is definitely expert, so I apologize if I get any of this wrong. But $47 million was Minnesota's share. The PCA has done a 3-phase deployment, doing 25% of the funds, 50% of the funds in phase 2, and then another 25% in phase 3. In phase 1, we are using the full allowed 15% for charging infrastructure. The Pollution Control Agency solicited public input on priorities ahead of each round of grants through public meetings, and they did hear a lot from stakeholders that investing in electric vehicles, both on the heavy-duty side and then in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, was very important. And I'll note that all the grants were open source, but there are for fuel source, but they do have 2 that are running right now, or 1 that's running right now that is specifically for heavy-duty electric vehicles, so school buses, transit buses, trucks, airport ground support equipment, et cetera. And so that's a broad range solicitation that's open right now. So why should regulators follow the VW settlement? The first thing I think that's really important is information and data about EVs. As regulators we're all aware, the electric vehicle coming onto the distribution system and onto the grid can have profound impacts. Those can be positive or they can be detrimental depending on how you integrate them. And so having this type of information, even if it's just the limited amount from the VW settlement, is a really important first step to learn about where different either school districts or other private industries are really interested in electrification and kind of getting that snapshot. So in Minnesota, the PCA publishes the selected project locations, and so they can determine where the infrastructure needs are being met. We can see where utility programs are duplicating existing efforts or where there might be gaps that need to be filled. And in Minnesota, they designated electric vehicle charging corridors. And so as we're considering our utility infrastructure plans and looking at where they might be looking to deploy some type of EV infrastructure, we have that reference for where the VW settlement is going to be looking at that. Another really important thing is, I think, as regulators, the transportation sector is new. It's an area that we haven't dealt with historically, at least not in Minnesota. And so the Pollution Control Agency, their expertise in quantifying things like emissions reductions as part of the grant process could be really valuable if your utilities are using things like a cost-benefit analysis that has that emissions reductions in there to have a point of comparison from folks who are an expert in that. I think it's also really important we talk a lot about light-duty vehicles, but there are types of electrification that go beyond that, and not only on transit buses, but you could have heavy-duty off-road equipment that's going to have an impact if it is something that's currently run by propane, but now it's going to be electrified. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a tour of the Port of Long Beach as they electrified their equipment there, and that was a huge impact and a huge increase in electrical infrastructure that was needed on site. So I think thinking through those things as regulators, and you're considering distribution system planning, integrated resource planning, and knowing where that kind of load might be coming on is really valuable. And then finally, I think a lot of other state agencies can be unfamiliar with the commission process. And so this is a great opportunity to engage with them on the work that you're doing and think about how their processes are starting to interact more with what the commission's doing, and invite them to participate where it's appropriate, such as on things like emissions reductions, state goals around vehicle electrification. And so they may suggest ways to link, they may really want to suggest ways that the VW settlement money can be incorporated into commission processes, but right now they just don't know how commissions make decisions, where utilities are proposing things. And so I think this is a really great opportunity to engage with other state agencies and even project grantee recipients around vehicle and transportation electrification. So aside from the VW settlement in Minnesota, we also have an interagency EV working group, and our goal is to share information about agency work on EVs. So this is really cross-agency throughout the state. And we meet on a quarterly basis. It's pretty informal. It's staff from different agencies, and we just discuss what we're working on. But it's another good opportunity to kind of share with other agencies what commission processes you might have open, where other agencies might find it valuable to weigh in on the commission process, or where the commission might need to be aware of efforts that other state agencies have. And so then I want to spend a bit of time talking about where the challenges for public utility commissions come in when we're talking about interacting with the Volkswagen settlement. So as we all are aware, timing can be a big concern. Regulatory processes and utility programs might not always line up with Volkswagen settlement grants timing. And so it could be difficult to have charging providers access both if they're looking to supplement pools of funds to get that both done at the same time. There can also be legal challenges to utility infrastructure proposals that can push out things on the utility side and the commission side, and that could leave charging providers in limbo, other organizations that are looking to apply for funds, and it can make it really difficult for them to move forward with their project and meet any obligations they have under the VW settlement money. There can also be an issue where the VW settlement manager can't talk to utilities and PUCs about projects that have applied for grants. So that could be difficult to coordinate. And then there's always information asymmetry where we don't necessarily have information from charging providers, other government entities, unless it's been put into our written record at a commission proceeding. And so outside of a formal proceeding, that can also make it difficult to get this information if the right people aren't at the table and if they aren't aware of what's going on, to get information about the VW settlement, how those funds could impact the utility proposal without someone putting it in the record. And so I wanted to talk about an example that we had in Minnesota. Go back to the previous slide. Our largest utility, Xcel Energy, was proposing a make-ready infrastructure pilot, and they plan to reach out to applicants that were also applying for VW settlement money to try and extend that farther. But the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency did point out that in order for the utility infrastructure or investment to stretch the VW funds farther, it has to lower the total project cost, not just the cost to the site house, but it had to it had to bring that cost down. Otherwise, it's not really going to expand the pool of money that was available. And so I think that's an example of, you know, our utility had really good intentions to try and work with the pollution control agency, but there was a little bit of a gap there with knowledge of how the different processes worked. And then from a timing standpoint, the PCA also pointed out that if based on how the funds are paid on a reimbursement basis, if a charging station obtained of investment from Excel, the lower project cost, the project cost even after getting a VW grant, the extra funds could be used for a future charging station. So the big takeaway is that it's important for utilities to talk with the VW grant administrator when designing their programs, not just the PUC. And I think the PUC can really help facilitate this role. Timing doesn't have to line up exactly, and they don't need to be codependent on each other, but they do need to be in the same ballpark if you're looking to align utility programs with VW settlement money. And then I just wanted to briefly talk about what other entities you might want to reach out to on EVs. There's lots and lots of state agencies that are working on electric vehicles in your state, and they can be really valuable sources of information. And I wanted to highlight a recent partnership that we had working with the Department of Vehicle Services to get data on EV registrations, and that's how I was able to make the nice map on an earlier slide. And so it's really helpful to have that type of information when you've got utilities doing EV forecasts, adoptions in rate cases or resource planning, and the utility really liked having that information too. So it was a good opportunity for us to build relationship with our utilities. And that's all I've got. Thanks.
So our next speaker is Dan Weekly from Virginia Dominion Power. Dan, do you want to take it away?
Well, Commissioner, thank you so much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. We're excited about talking about many of the ideas that have been discussed in this call about putting them into action. And those of you who are not familiar with Dominion, we are a utility headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. We have facilities and operations in 18 different states. And we have roughly 6.5 million customers that are pretty equally divided between the natural gas side and then the electric side of our business. And for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to focus primarily on Virginia, but we'll also talk a little bit about our electric operations in in North Carolina and then in South Carolina as well. So as we started looking of all the opportunities that are out there long term, the issues that Dominion, like many other utilities, has is how do we bring more renewables onto the system? I think it's fair to say that most are fans and most see the value that renewables bring, but the battery storage technology is key to making that work. So as we were looking at this, we started looking hard, 5 or 6 months ago, at the school bus industry. And one of the things that we really liked about school buses, obviously, is they run dedicated routes, they are in centralized parking, they typically operate about half of the year, about 180 days a year. And so we thought we continue to see what about electrification of the school bus industry. And that had started a few years ago, but we've just seen that technology just jump light years just in the last year or two. So we just saw that opportunity. So when you look at the school bus fleet across the country, there are more than 450,000 school buses operating today. If you look at the federal guidelines for them, they turn over pretty frequently. The federal guidelines indicate that buses should be retired after 15 years or if they reach 250,000 miles. So when you think about the turnover in that kind of vehicle, there are roughly 45,000 new school buses made every year. And that's primarily through 3 major builders here in the United States. There's the Bluebird Company, which builds them in Georgia. There's the Thomas Company, which builds them in High Point, North Carolina, and the other one is a company called IC, which is a division of Navistar, builds them in Oklahoma. And all three are now building electric school buses. And there's actually a fourth manufacturer, a primary manufacturer, a company called Lion out of Canada, who has several hundred of these vehicles operating today. So we challenged ourselves internally that says, well, with these vehicles out there, what is it really going to take to get the electric vehicles on the road? How do we help the jurisdictions make that decision? But the one thing that we've all been kind of thinking about for a long time is how do we use those batteries to benefit all of our customers? So it is a technology. Of course, everyone's familiar with the volts to grid, or it just goes by the acronym of V to G. If you'll go to the next slide. So we basically said, okay, if we can make the V to G work, that is really opens up the door to bring lots of value to our customers and the jurisdictions in which we serve. Some of the history on electric school buses so far has been the manufacturer's claim, and we're seeing this, those who have implemented them, they cost about 60% less, including fuel, to operate these vehicles because the maintenance is so much lower. And then, when you look at a diesel bus, many of the older buses are only getting 6 to 7 miles per gallon. Now, the newer buses are better, no question about that. But when you compare that to an electric bus, which will get roughly 17 miles per gallon equivalent, there is just a huge opportunity when it comes to that program. So one of the things that we kind of our guiding lights, as it were, when we started this program at Dominion was we made the decision basically on day one that if we were going to pursue this program, that we did not want jurisdictions to pay anything more for an electric bus than they would pay for a diesel bus. And the average diesel bus, depending on the option, is about $100,000. These vehicles are very expensive. Probably in the $325,000 to $350,000 range per bus, because they just have not put them in mass production. We are absolutely convinced that over time, these vehicles will drop significantly in price. So the way that we have structured our program is that jurisdictions will pay no more at all. They will pay that $100,000 for the diesel bus as they would, but Dominion will make up the delta associated with that, as well as we will do all the make-ready and infrastructure, including chargers for that. So it is the quote-unquote complete package for them to put these vehicles out there. Based on the numbers that we've seen from some other pilots, that will represent a huge savings to the jurisdiction, somewhere in the neighborhood. Of course, it'll depend on how many miles they drive per bus per day, but somewhere, if you use the average of 15,000 miles of a year on a school bus, which is the national average, by the way, each school district will save roughly $700 per month per bus. So there's a huge incentive for the jurisdictions to get behind this program. Next slide, please. So when you think about the V2G, and as a sidebar to that is the managed charging. So if I could address the managed charging first. When the school buses return, let's just say 4 o'clock in the afternoon after they've run their route, the driver will plug the vehicle in their centralized parking, but we will probably send that bus a signal not to charge at a peak time at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon in May when it's pretty hot, or, we've been really hot here in Virginia for the last couple of weeks. Matter of fact, we've been setting records about how warm and dry it's been. So we probably wouldn't have that vehicle to charge. So if we could spread our load out, all customers would benefit from that. So instead of that vehicle charging at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll send it a signal and tell it to charge at 9 o'clock at night. So basically when the load starts rolling off, it's a huge value to us to do that. Now on the V2G side of that is when the buses are parked primarily in the summer months, it gives us the opportunity to draw power from those batteries, and maybe we don't have to start a power station somewhere on our system. So the avoided emissions are huge when it comes to that. And if you've ever Googled the air quality within a school bus, there are study after study that talks about, the diesel emissions tend to get trapped in those vehicles because of the way that they are designed. And the more that the bus stops and the front door opens, the worse off the emissions are inside of it. So seldom does it come along when you've got a solution that solves two problems, but we believe this one does. It's better for the kids and the air quality within the school bus, and of course that covers the bus driver as well, but it gives the ability for us to draw from those batteries and both for capacity and VAR, or frequency support. And to tell you the scale of the program, which we'll kind of jump to the next slide, we're going to do this in multiple phases. The first phase of this is we're talking to the vendors right now. As a matter of fact, they all have an RFP out. We have an RFP out to them, which they have to respond to shortly, is we are going to deploy 50 of these buses as quickly as we can get them out there. Realistically, that will be about a year from now, by the time we get through the purchase order process and get them built and delivered and the jurisdictions trained on them. And we're going to do that in what we refer to as base rates. And of course, for all the regulators on the call here, what that really means for us is we're not asking for pre-approval. We're not asking for rate treatment in advance of this, of what we think this program the value that it brings to our customers. So we're just going to go ahead and do it. And then we will show our commission the benefits in our next case, which will be in 2022. We've also indicated, with our governor's support, that we are going to ask our legislature for permission that this is a viable expense from us moving forward to purchase up to 200 of these buses for the next 5 years. And that is roughly a 20% replacement on the buses. Virginia buys about 1,000 buses a year. So 200 a year will get us to over 1,000 buses, including the first 50, by 2025. The significance of that is by 2025, we will have more than 200 megawatts of battery storage capability with these buses. So that's what really gives us when we say that we may have to, or we may not have to start a power station, when you think about that type of capacity out there. Now, granted, we will only have it for 4 to 5 hours because the charger is the limiting factor in this. But when you think of 200 megawatts over 4 to 5 hours, that will get us through our peak period. So we're really excited about that and recognizing it is a challenge to get that operational. So what we've asked the state to consider, the state of Virginia to consider in the future is beyond 2025, that 50% of all the diesel bus replacements switch over to electric after 2025, and then a state goal by 2030 that 100% of all the diesel bus replacements will be to electric by that period of time. So you can see that very aggressive, but we're pretty passionate about it. We were also really pleased a couple of weeks ago, that's our plan. But to the specifics of this call, then Governor Northam announced what I'll call a complementary program to us, because in Virginia, we cover about 2/3 of the state. He announced the state's intention to put in $20 million of the VW settlement money to buy additional buses for program or areas of the state not covered by Dominion. So we were talking to our state regulators on the environmental side as well as the education side about how to implement that program. And we want to thank the governor for offering up that program. So as you can see, Virginia is very focused on this technology, and in just a handful of years, we fully expect to have between 1,100 and 1,200 of these electric buses operating across our system. So not surprisingly, we have heard from many utilities across the country asking for more background on this, and the request to share data and to understand exactly the finances behind this. So, and of course, we're talking to all of them, and I'm sure many of them are involved in the states of folks that represent states on this call. So that's what's happening in Virginia, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
Okay, Dan, thank you so much. I think what we've decided is the next remaining time will be reserved for questions, comments. So let me start. We do have one question from our audience. I will go ahead and read off the first question that I see here in my queue. And what we'll do for this particular listener, we're going to go ahead and unmute it if you want to follow up from your question. So the first question I have is, what is the fractional basis for allocating mitigation funds to states? In parentheses, prorated, population, number of registered vehicles.
So I don't exactly know the details. This is Nick. I don't know exactly the details of the formula, but it was based on the number of Volkswagen vehicles that you had.
Okay.
In your state.
The same listener, this question is for Hannah. The question is, what is a message for or to the health department?
So I'm wondering if the question's more about what the role of the health department might be. In Minnesota, at least, I would say that a number of our state agencies are looking at the benefits to electric vehicles, and so from the health department, our health department's been looking at it from emissions reduction, especially point source emissions. So in communities where there's higher asthma rates because of vehicle pollution within them, I think that's why they've been focused on transportation electrification. And so I'd say that the last slide was just more a point of think about other state agencies that are working on these issues and might be interested in knowing what your commission is doing.
Right. Thank you, Hannah. The next question I have in the queue is, why is school bus MPG equivalent relevant to school board owner/operator? That's in parentheses. Isn't bottom line life cycle cost and or annual budget cost the decision factor? And what about safety? Why would a school system help Dominion manage demand profile with bus batteries?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, most school districts, the fuel is a huge part of their budget. When you look at how many miles per gallon that the buses get, it's all about the dollars that they have to put into that. Now, obviously, they don't pay for state and federal taxes, the road taxes, when they pay for their diesel. But I can tell you the school districts that we've been talking to have their fuel bills are in the millions of dollars per year. So obviously, if you could increase their miles per gallon, their overall cost to operate the system goes way down, which gives them additional dollars to put into the classroom or salaries or obviously whatever they want to do with that. So the second part of that question is if it helps them decrease their overall cost is the benefit, but when you also look at the emissions profile as well as the piece of managed charging is when you think about community benefit, if we don't have to start or build another facility out there to generate power, that helps keep all customers' costs down. So the managed charging piece of that is a very big piece. And there is no differentiation in our program. We're not establishing a new rate for charging EVs. They're paying the exact same rate that they would pay for lights in a school building or a municipal building or anything else. It is all the same rate.
Thanks, Dan. I actually have another question for you coming in. This is for you. What is the anticipated annual revenue from energy sales to charge these buses?
Yeah, so obviously that's going to vary based upon how many miles or how long the routes are. But I will tell you, when you look at it in price, again, it's going to reduce the jurisdiction's rate by about 60%, and that does include fuel. But what we're thinking about, it's going to be somewhere in the equivalent of 2 average homes per month. So, somewhere in that range. So it is not a huge growth opportunity in sales for us. That's not the way we're looking at it.
Thank you. So at this time, I don't have any other questions in the queue. So I have prepared a list of questions for our panelists. And if any of the listeners can think of anything based on that conversation, certainly feel free to jump in. So this is open really to anyone on the panel. Explain generally who is applying for these VW funds. Is it fleet owners, municipalities? I know we talked a lot about schools and school buses. And is it a utility applying? And I ask that just for background in case some listeners may not know.
So I can get started, and I'm sure others can chime in here. There are lots of entities who've received funds from the Volkswagen settlement so far. Just, when it's when it comes to the transit buses programs that I talked about, those are all public transit agencies. For light duty electric vehicle charging equipment, I know we've been talking about Virginia a lot today, but one of the bigger electric vehicle spends so far with Volkswagen was for a fast charging network that was awarded to EVgo, a private company. Similarly, ChargePoint won an award in Maine for fast charging infrastructure. So in essence, it really depends on what the public agency's interest is and who they're targeting. The funds have been given directly to other public agencies or private companies.
Okay, so I know that this process may vary from state to state, but how would the process generally work? I'm thinking in terms of cycles or rounds of application and funding, a typical wait time or paperwork, and whether there's capped amounts.
That's kind of up to the states and how they want to distribute the funds. Some states are choosing to distribute funds very quickly, maybe perhaps to fill backlogs and budget gaps that they've had. Arizona, for example, funded a lot of school buses at once recently. Other states are choosing to kind of stagger the money to hopefully to get perhaps more bang for the buck by not spending so much at once and waiting for some of these technologies to develop more. That's all flexible and up to them, so long as it conforms with the settlement terms. And that's really up to the states to make that determination. They're required to validate that their plans fit the settlement terms.
Okay. Maybe this question, I'm guessing maybe Hana can answer this best. So in your opinion, what are some of the first steps a PUC, for those listening, can or should take in coordinating with their sister agencies who are managing these VW funds? I know you mentioned in your presentation, at least for Minnesota, you guys have a coordinated working group. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on things like, other PUCs doing workshops or opening dockets or, working groups. So if you could share with the audience kind of what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, in Minnesota, we opened what we call them generic dockets. So it was an investigation into EV charging. And that was one of the first opportunities that our pollution control agency weighed in. So I would say, to the extent that your state commission is looking at opening some kind of broad look at policy considerations around transportation electrification, find out who is administering the Volkswagen settlement and make sure that they are invited to participate in any stakeholder meetings that you have. And I think it's also useful just to have at a staff level to talk to other staff at that agency. It doesn't have to come through a formal commission proceeding, just to talk to each other and find out what's going on. And a lot of times that's how you're going to build good relationships. So when it does come time for another state agency to weigh in, they know who you are. They can ask you questions. They can ask you questions about the process, and they can weigh in with confidence where it's appropriate for them to do so. And that is something that I've gone and done, is engage with our Department of Transportation, our Department of Administration groups, just giving them a basic overview of what the Public Utilities Commission is, how we do our decision making, and how they can weigh in. Because I think a lot of these groups just haven't been engaged with this traditionally, but I think we'll see more and more of that when we start to move into electrification and vehicle electrification in particular.
Thank you. And Hana, just sort of piggybacking off of that, and for anybody else on the panel who wants to jump in. So in a situation where a PUC has perhaps authorized a pilot program, and that program is dependent upon some of these VW settlement funds. What are some of the coordination efforts that are going on, I guess, behind the scenes, either between the utility and the manager of those funds, and maybe what are some of those challenges to that kind of thing?
So I'm not sure. We haven't had any pilots come through that are directly linked to any VW settlement money. I think, as I mentioned, we've had Excel talk about how they would be interested in kind of trying to find the same folks fit in. But I think, like I said before, I think the challenges with the grant administration, where the administrator can't really talk to other ongoing projects because of restrictions around non-collusion clauses, could be a barrier. But maybe Nick could talk more to some other states that have had more experience.
I'm struggling to come up with a good example of where there's been that kind of coordination to date. We're still kind of in the first year of distributing funds, and I would say that most states that have done these kind of requests for proposals and awards has done it more in a traditional capacity, where they've kind of done it through the agency that would normally distribute funds like that. So I don't really have a good example right now where that potential coordination would have to be done.
Sure, and this is Commissioner Bocanegra. I think I'll just observe, to the panelists and to everybody listening. I think that like you said, maybe that remains to be seen, and it's something we'll all have to watch out for. So Dan, this question is for you. In your example, does Dominion own the battery in the bus, or are you guys owning the buses itself?
Yeah, so good question. We are actually owning the battery, the motor, and all the infrastructure. So, and then the vehicles will be split titled, and the titles will indicate we own those components, and obviously we're responsible for them. And then the jurisdiction will own the remaining portion of the bus. And
to your knowledge, Dan, do you know of any other utility across the country doing a similar thing where they own the battery or buying the buses themselves?
I am familiar in North Carolina. Duke indicated a desire to own the batteries. I don't know about the motor and the infrastructure, but I know that proceeding has not been heard before. I don't think it's been heard for the North Carolina Utilities Commission yet. So I think that was their idea, but I don't think that action is taken. So I think we are the first in the country to follow this path. I will also say that we have gotten feedback from our jurisdictions asking in our thoughts on Dominion owning the vehicles, complete vehicles, and the jurisdictions leasing them back from us. Now, as you know, under government, the way that the financing works, those who do lease vehicles currently do them at a very low rate, typically at 1% or lower because of their profile. So that is something that we're open to, and we're going to offer that up. Is something that our legislature indicates that'd be something that they'd be interested in. Dominion would be interested in that, but that's not something that's not intended to be additional revenue generation. The challenge for school bus acquisition has been they kind of have two pots of money. They have their O&M dollars, and then the other side is when they look at capital dollars, and capital dollars are the ones that typically get cut when budgets get tight. So that kind of puts the pressure on whether you can replace those buses as often as you should. And we've heard lots of stories about capital money getting cut and then buses going far beyond their 15-year life. As a matter of fact, we have one jurisdiction that applied to us that indicated they just replaced lots of buses that were more than 30 years old. So they were doubly past their life. I will also say one additional, I forgot to mention this before, and I apologize, one additional requirement that we are putting on any jurisdiction that wants to partner with us on this program is we are going to require that the school buses have seatbelts on them. That is not a federal requirement, and it is not a requirement in Virginia. The NTSB last year came out with that recommendation that all school buses should have seatbelts. but safety is a core value at Dominion, as it is with most of the utilities across the country. And so we wanted the maximum safe vehicles out there for our students.
Thank you, Dan. And I apologize, I missed, I know that Commissioner Lipschultz is on the line with Hana. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nayruk, who will end the webinar with a final thought from Commissioner Lipschultz. And I think there's some announcements to be made. So thank you all so much.
Hi, Commissioner, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have any final thoughts. I actually had a couple of questions for Dan, if that's okay.
Sure.
I was just wondering, what's Dominion's total investment for the bus purchases and the make-ready infrastructure expected to be over the 5 years program? And then maybe as a second related question, so what's Dominion's business case for the investment? And I guess in other words, what are the quantifiable benefits to the utilities, ratepayers, and shareholders?
Yep. So I can't tell you what it's going to be in 5 years because we really don't know what the bus manufacturers and the charging manufacturers. And by the way, we required that the bus manufacturers include their recommended charger as part of their bid. That's due back to us in a couple of weeks. But phase one, which is the first 50, our internal budget for that, or what we've indicated, is it'll be between $14 and $15 million in phase one. So that's for the buses, that $200,000 delta, and the make-ready infrastructure that you're investing in, and the chargers, yes. Okay, and the chargers. Okay. Yeah. Yep. And so when you talk about the value chain for the customers, there's kind of two fronts to that. There's the environmental benefit based on the health issues within the bus for the kids as part of the case. There is part of the case of not having a power station out there of whatever fuel type you're running, so to that. But it's interesting you would ask the question that way because we see the value of the batteries as pretty equal to the value of the actual sales of electricity. So when it comes to that capacity value and VAR support, they're pretty equal to the actual retail sales. Okay, so when you talk about that $15 million investment, you're really looking at that as a net plus for ratepayers that you can quantify? Yes. Now, I will also tell you it's hard to quantify that in the early years because the delta is so high. What we have kind of viewed this is if you really want this industry to take off, I'm certainly not the expert when it comes to school bus pricing and manufacturing costs. But until you get school bus manufacturing in full production mode, and again, they make about 15,000 buses a year. When you think about that, you're going to have to get these buses, I don't know what the magic number is, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 buses a year to get these buses under $200,000. If you get them under that $200,000 bracket, and when you look at the total cost of ownership for a jurisdiction, if the numbers work out from what we have seen so far of that savings of about $8,000 per year, all of a sudden it's best for the jurisdictions to start actually buying these vehicles, because then the total cost of ownership number goes way down. And the V to G is really what drives that early value for a utility to get behind that. So that's where we see ultimately the customer value in this long term. That's really helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. We just have a few quick announcements. First of all, if you're a NARUC member, that is if you're a commissioner or staff at a commission, make sure to reach out to myself at charper@naruc.org if you're interested in joining our EV working group. We'll be creating a working group of commissioners and staff to keep talking about the EV issues that we raised today. And the next announcement is that the next CPI innovation webinar is occurring on November 7th. The topic is using energy efficiency to meet peak demand. And finally, there is an NRRI webinar occurring in a few days on October 16th The topic is disconnections and delinquencies, lessons learned, and next steps. So go to narucs.org/NRRI if you're interested in registering for that. But thank you so much to all of you for attending, and thanks to our panelists today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.